From DLA Piper, this is the U.S. Latin America Panorama Podcast. This podcast series focuses on the latest developments across the Americas and globally, highlighting business, legal, economic, and political developments affecting businesses daily. This episode features Francisco Cerezo, partner and chair of the U.S. Latin America practice, and cross-border partners Amadeu Ribeiro, Marcello Hallake, and Bruno Soares, focused on Brazil.
Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here with everyone and appreciate your joining what I believe is now our fourth DLA Piper Latin America Panorama podcast. As you all know, we launched a series earlier this year. We've had some terrific discussions on AI, current affairs in Latin America, UK, Latin America relations and investment and economic ties between the UK and Latin America. They've been extremely well received by friends across the pond in the Americas. We now continue with this new tradition of the DLA Latin America podcast. And I'm delighted to be joined today by three of my partners. I can't think of anyone better to join me in a discussion on Brazil. So everyone knows Brazil, just by sheer scale, Brazil is its own planet, if you will. When you think about Latin America, it's clearly the largest economy in Latin America. Many global corporates have a Latin America strategy and a separate Brazil strategy. And that's because Brazil, whether it's during boom times or perhaps more austere or difficult times, just by sheer scale, there's always tremendous opportunities, particularly for those who can navigate the spaces in Brazil and have, as they say in Spanish, el juego de pie, to navigate the waters in Brazil, regardless of political climate, social, economic, or otherwise. Indeed, a quick plug. We just actually launched DLA Piper Brazil. We opened our foreign legal consultancy in Sao Paulo, so we're thrilled about that. So the timing of this couldn't be better. We celebrated the opening of our Sao Paulo office earlier this week. Indeed, I had the pleasure of being with my three friends and partners who will be joining us today in Brazil earlier this week and just landed today from Brazil. I'm excited to have a conversation with them and get their thoughts on everything from the economic climate in Brazil, opportunities for investment in Brazil, and a series of other things that I know are top of mind for people looking at opportunities in Brazil. So with that, and without further ado, I'll introduce them in alphabetical order by their first names: Amadeu Ribeiro, Bruno Soares, and Marcello Hallake. Amadeu and Marcello are partners of DLA Piper in New York. Bruno is a partner who splits his time between Sao Paulo, spends a significant amount of time in New York, but he's managing partner of DLA Piper in Brazil. So all three are Brazilians, so no one better than them to really share their thoughts, insights on the current environment in Brazil and the road ahead. So with that, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your joining us, and thank you for joining us on this podcast. I'll try to divvy up the questions, but chime in as you deem fit and appropriate. So I'll start with Amadeu, and would love, Amadeu, just to get your sense on Brazil today. You hear about GDP growth, inflation, job market in Brazil. What are your thoughts on the state of affairs today in Brazil?
Thank you, Francisco. And I'm delighted to be here. And I'm thrilled about the launching of our office in Sao Paulo. And it's great to be with my fellow partners in this Brazil initiative, Marcello and Bruno. I will start on a positive note. Brazil is growing. GDP will grow by 2 or 3% in 2024, which is quite a good rate. What is driving that growth? Mainly commodities stemming from agriculture and oil and gas activities. Brazil had last year a record year in agriculture, while in 2024, oil and gas production is growing by an impressive 7% rate. The growth rate is likely to continue for the next several years. So Brazil, which you wouldn't think necessarily as an oil and gas powerhouse, by 2030 will be known as a major oil exporter in the world. When it comes to inflation, also positive news. We are at 3.7% per year, with the core CPI, the Consumer Price Index, under 3%, which is super impressive if you look at global standards these days. In this context, you would think that interest rates would be lower. That, however, remains a challenge for Brazil. They're still quite high at around 13%. The reason is, well, Brazil is in a global economy, and the reason why the central bank is not cutting interest rates is simple. Interest rates in the US remain high, and the US stock market continues to perform really well. These factors are driving investors to the US, and by keeping interest rates high, the Brazilian central bank is simply doing the math of what it takes to maintain Brazil attractive. The other challenge is the fiscal deficit. Internationally, Brazil has a net surplus. We have very substantial dollar reserves, so no issues internationally. The issue lies in the domestic deficit, which is quite high. On a positive note, the reason that is not maybe such a huge source of concern is that we currently have a well-balanced government, a left-wing government in the executive and a Congress that tilts to the right. And as a result, any attempts by the federal government to increase spending are not moving forward. The other piece of good news is the tax reform, which is promoting a dramatic simplification of the tax system, with 7 taxes being reduced to 1 or 2 over the next few years. So, all things considered, I think Brazil is in a relatively good position.
Interesting, Amadeu. Certainly from a stateside perspective, everyone was very closely paying attention to the elections and whether it wound up being Lula and not Bolsonaro. And now, the dust settles, right? And then speculation leading up to elections creates uncertainty. But now time has passed. Lula has now his administration has been in place for a bit. So, Bruno, now that the dust has settled, if you could comment on what Amadeu said, your thoughts on the state of economic affairs, opportunities, how the job market is looking. Would love your thoughts, especially you're there on a day-to-day basis. Amadeu and Marcello travel regularly, but you're there every day. So how are you seeing things?
No, what Amadeu said was right on spot. I just want to add a few pieces here and there. One of them is on the FX. There is a trend at this time that the real will devaluate against the dollar. And this trend can be very good for business to the extent that the prices of assets in Brazil will adjust, and this will foster further investments of our international clients into Brazil. So, in other words, the Brazilian assets will become less expensive, and this should generate more M&A work for all of us. The other piece is the high interest rates that we are seeing right now. These high interest rates, to some extent, are driving refinancings, they're driving reschedules, renegotiation of loans, financings, and further capital raising as well. So this all ties up new transactions, new engagements for all of us. To some degree, the high interest rates are also causing a few companies to file for the Brazilian equivalent of Chapter 11 or an out-of-court reorganization, which in due course will stabilize. But there's a solid flow of work in all these practices, banking, corporate and M&A, and also the restructuring angle, which are good for the lawyers, good for investors, generate a lot of opportunities. In terms of markets and opportunities, tying into what Amadeu said, the agribusiness sector is booming and should continue to boom, regardless of what happened recently with the floods and the natural disaster that we had in Rio Grande do Sul. We should have more and more transactions in the agribusiness sector, both in terms of corporate and M&A consolidations and financings. A significant portion of the Brazilian agriculture sector is designed to be exported, and this is a significant portion of our practice as well. We do a number of trade financings, such as soft commodity financings, fertilizers, and importers. So these are good deals, good business, and they should continue to be in place. Oil and gas, with Petrobras coming up with a stream of FPSOs, drilling rigs, drill ships, and further investments in refineries throughout Brazil. We should have a lot of activity in there. Pulp and paper, with new plants and projects being developed, also debottlenecks of the existing projects that are on the ground right now. So there's so much to be done and so many opportunities. And it's great that we have this amazing team, which is a multi-function, multicultural, and multi-practice team targeting all the verticals within the country.
Excellent. Thank you, Bruno. So, Marcello, Bruno just mentioned agribusiness. Amadeu mentioned oil and gas. Brazil is known, certainly within Latin America, the broader Americas, as a place that has significant activity in the fintech space as well. Could you share your thoughts, big picture, anything you want to say as an economic outlook, just as Amadeu and Bruno said, but specifically, I'd love your thoughts, Marcello, of what sectors are you seeing of having increased an uptick in activity and that are trending as hot sectors, if you will, for foreign direct investment and otherwise in Brazil?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be on this with my Brazilian partners and with this great team, and also very excited as we are all after having launched the Sao Paulo office foreign legal consultancy just this week. So very excited for all the opportunities ahead. As Amadeu and Bruno have mentioned, I think that the sectors that we are seeing as having a lot of activities, and we're getting calls and we're talking to clients about the agri sector, the energy, oil and gas sector, the green energy field. I think that there are lots of opportunities, and this government seems to be trying to show a different message, more positive. So there are lots of opportunities in those sectors. Infrastructure is always an opportunity in Brazil because of the sheer size of the country and because of everything that needs to be done to improve the infrastructure and communications. There are always large infrastructure projects, so we expect to see activity in this regard. Also, the healthcare sector is one that is generating a lot of activity that we have been seeing active. So there are a few hospital groups that are in consolidation and for sale and for purchase. So there is activity in this sector, both with Brazilian and with US players on the buyer and on the seller side. Then we mentioned natural resources, which is a sector that is active and where there are a number of interests that we're seeing. And this is not only domestic, but there is a continuing trend and probably increasing trend of Asian and Chinese investment into Brazil for a variety of reasons. One of them has to do with the fact that the Chinese entries into the US are becoming more complicated. And as a result, the Chinese companies are looking for other markets. And one of those that we're seeing that they have a keen interest on is in Latin America, and Brazil chiefly among those, in addition to the constant needs that the Chinese have in natural resources and in the products that Brazil has to offer. So I think that in a nutshell, these are the sectors that I'm seeing activity and interest in.
So, Bruno, Marcelo mentioned obviously Asia, Chinese investors, obviously the US. And clearly, again, because of the sheer scale of Brazil, there's some formidable national players that drive a lot of the economic activity. But beyond the formidable national players, the US and Asia, any other countries that come to mind in your experience, any other regions of the world, whether within Europe, any particular countries in Europe or anywhere else globally that you're seeing increased economic activity and foreign direct investment opportunities from those countries into Brazil in your experience?
Oh, absolutely. It's been very active in different geographies as well. We cannot avoid to include in this list the South Koreans, the Japanese investors, the Japanese trading house, the South Korean conglomerates who have been very, very active, not only in Brazil, but throughout the Latin American region. And investors from the Middle East. So we're talking about the sovereign funds and also investors from the region, very active in all fronts, on all angles of the economy, being mining metals, being agriculture, oil and gas, transportation, logistics. And some of these investors from Asia and the Middle East, what they try to do here in the region is to mitigate the risk of running out of raw materials, of commodities, of supplies. So they tend to invest in the underlying business and also in the relevant logistics to let them take the commodity from the Brazilian inland or the Latin American inland to a port. So they're going to invest in a pipeline, they're going to invest in a railroad, they're going to invest in a port, so that the whole cycle is combined and is covered by their investment. So in such connection, we have seen over time investors from Asia, from the Middle East, investing in fully integrated mining projects with a mine, with a railroad facility, and a port facility. We have a couple of those in the pipeline, also in sugar and alcohol, for example, ethanol. And it's been quite interesting in that connection. These are huge projects and they combine multiple areas of expertise and are fantastic for a full service firm such as ourselves. You're going to have the environmental team, the regulatory team, the banking team, the projects team, the construction specialists, the mining specialists. So it's a fantastic set of projects. We cannot avoid to also mention the investment that the Asians have made in the power generation, power transmission sector with gas to power projects, with renewables projects, being wind, solar plants, or biomass. We are seeing more and more of those as well. And as Marcello said, the hydrogen, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen facilities being developed throughout the country. We have, I think, 17 or 18 different MOUs for hydrogen facilities in the state of Ceará alone. If all of those will take flight, we don't know, but it's sheer size and it illustrates how our clients and global players are investing in these sort of projects within Brazil. And finally, I think it's also important to highlight that the European investors, they continue to be very active and present, not only in Brazil, but throughout the region. So to give a few examples, Germany has been on the ground and there's a huge German community in Brazil and investors from Germany in Brazil. The same for France, the same for Italy and the UK. So these investors, they are active, they are present, and they continue to look into the various opportunities within the country. And they have their large corporates, their large banks heavily engaged and heavily involved with Brazil and the other jurisdictions within Latin America.
I'll open this before we move on to talk about the legal landscape and perhaps some of the trends in potential legal reforms, administrative law, regulatory reforms, which I'll pose that question to Amadeu to kick it off. But before we move to that topic, we've been discussing where we're seeing investment opportunities, what countries have been active in Brazil. Brazil has these phenomenal companies that have also grown and expanded globally. What are you seeing? What sectors of the large Brazilian corporates, the significant Brazilian companies that have gone either global or regional? If you could speak to markets, whether geographies or sectors that Brazilian corporates and significant Brazilian companies expanding into other markets in the Americas, Europe, Asia, and what sectors? Amadeu, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that one. Just before going into that question, and just to add to what Bruno and Marcello were saying earlier about countries investing in Brazil, that all is true and all positive news. We also can't forget the US, right, as a major partner to Brazil, and with so many investments being done by US companies in the country in areas from technology to healthcare and life sciences. Now, the reverse is also true. Brazil has been investing, expanding in Brazilian companies, expanding in the United States quite a bit. We see, especially in the energy space, I would say, we see our clients considering not only expanding organically, but also through acquisitions. We also see now that construction companies are back on their feet in Brazil. We see an expansion into Latin America and Africa by these companies. The mining sector remains also a source of exporting investments into other countries. Think about mining companies exporting, meaning making acquisitions in Canada, in Africa, and so on. So these are some of the examples that come to mind. So I'd say particularly energy and mining are key sectors in that respect.
Marcelo, anything you want to add to that, or Bruno?
Yeah, I would just want to add that what's interesting from our perspective as cross-border international lawyers that work with Brazil is that in the past, it used to be that what we would focus on would be advising particularly US and European companies, and then later on Asian companies as well, investing into Latin America and into Brazil. But in the recent years, and this is something that has been increasing a lot in recent years, is that we are now spending a lot of time also advising Brazilian companies that are looking at the world. And for us, there has been almost a little change in focus. We're doing both, but we see now a lot of these very large Brazilian global players that are looking at opportunities, either selling their products, but also making investments in the US, in the Middle East, in Europe, in Asia, in addition to tapping into the US capital markets, which has always been the case, and into the US financial system. So that's one of the reasons why we have established our foreign legal consultancy in Brazil. It's not only to be on the ground for foreign investors that are investing into Brazil, but it's also to be closer to the Brazilian corporates and financial institutions that have global needs.
You are absolutely correct, Marcelo. And in my experience, in these companies, the Brazilian super champions, as our President Lula likes to say, they're all these Brazilian large corporates. They are international, they are huge, and they are investing overseas. They have always played a special role in my practice. So if you look into the protein sector, there are 3 or 4 very large players that today produce more outside of Brazil than in Brazil. But these are Brazilian companies. The control is Brazilian, and these are huge conglomerates. You have the mining and metal sector with companies engaged not only in Brazil and Latin America, but also Canada, Africa, and portions of the Middle East and Asia. You have the banks and the fintechs. They are expanding and they are making significant investments in the US, in the UK, continental Europe, and to some degree, even Asia and the Pacific. Hotels and entertainment. We are now working on a transformational project for a Brazilian client in the Middle East, which is fantastic. So the Brazilians, they are branching out for a variety of reasons, and they're making a splash outside of Brazil. And this is not something that is happening now. It has been going on for the past 10, 12 years. And maybe now the companies and the management of these companies, they're becoming more sophisticated. But I think it's a trend that is here to only evolve and expand. And we'll see more and more of them. And I think it's our role to team up with them and assist them on a global basis.
So when there's a change in administration, whether it's in the US, in Brazil, in Chile, you name it, regardless of country, when there's a change in administration, and particularly when there are different political parties, different political philosophies, ideologies, public policy, invariably that can also translate to then changes in regulatory and legal frameworks. And when there was a transition by Bolsonaro, who was more on the right wing, and then Lula more on left wing, if you will, there was concern of what changes may be coming, how that could impact foreign direct investment into Brazil, how it could impact the ability of the Brazilian global corporates to expand outside of Brazil. So perhaps, Amadeu, if you could speak to, particularly in this last year, any notable changes or tendencies in the legal and regulatory framework that are worth noting for people looking at opportunities in Brazil, or even indeed for Brazilian businesses looking to expand abroad.
Of course. So, Francisco, our FDI regime, if you will, remains stable. Brazil, if you put it in the context of what we're seeing in the world today, with so many nations becoming more protectionist, Brazil, I would say, is an outlier in the sense that it is really open for business. If you look at what's happened in the past several years, we've witnessed a continuation of liberalization of markets. This has been going on actually for a few decades. In sector after sector where you saw restrictions on foreign investment, these have been abolished. The latest to fall were perhaps the airline industry, the healthcare industry. The only one that remains, I think, more reserved, I would say, for domestic investors is really investments in rural land, where you see some restrictions on the part of foreign investments. You saw that under the previous government, you see it still under Lula, but still the acquisition, notwithstanding the fact that you can't, as a foreigner, own foreign land in the traditional sense, there are many ways to still make use of land and to be partner of Brazilian companies in projects that involve properties throughout Brazil. So this limitation, it's pretty workable in terms of teaming up with companies and doing business in Brazil. So it hasn't really been an impediment. So overall, I think Brazil, as I said, is open to business. The other sector that's really remarkable, I would say, is the banking industry. The liberalization that we saw, not only in terms of the sector being open for foreign direct investment, but more so in terms of regulations promoting new entrants and promoting market entries, promoting competition, that led to the creation of a number of new companies. And this gave rise to a number of opportunities, in particular for venture capital, investing in new startups that have grown to become major companies in financial services. So the fintechs that we saw emerging out of that trend are now listed at NASDAQ or have become prominent companies in the financial sector. So that's all good news in terms of our FDI regime. So I think that Brazil in that respect is remarkable. Politically speaking, the country is also in a good position, being both in a good relationship with the Middle East, with China. while at the same time being a great partner to the United States. That is not something easy to achieve, but Brazil has managed to stay in that position for quite some time.
Interesting.
If I can just add, and I agree with everything Amadeu was saying, I can just add that with respect to Brazil being less protectionist than it was in the past, and particularly comparatively with the rest of the world, I think that's an interesting development because a couple of decades ago, Brazil was known to be very protectionist, and that has changed over the recent years. And when we particularly think about foreign investment, when in the US, on our cross-border transactions and on investments in the US, by foreign companies, we spend a lot of time now worrying about CFIUS and about all the scrutiny that the US government is putting and barriers on certain strategic foreign investments into the US. And there is no such equivalent at all in Brazil, which is quite remarkable, so far at least. And to my knowledge, there is no plan that will change anytime soon. Also, adding to your question on change of government, there has been a significant change in government. And at the same time, with respect to business, there hasn't been a major impact into the flow of investments. There are less privatizations, no doubt, because part of the prior government was to try and focus on privatizations. And there was a privatization program, and that has stopped under this government. On the other hand, that is expected to result into some investments by, for example, Petrobras. Instead of Petrobras selling assets as they were in the prior governments, now it seems that they will be acquiring assets, and perhaps not only in Brazil, but also outside of Brazil. What we do see is some privatizations at the state level, because some states are privatizing some of their assets, such as in Sao Paulo with the Sabes, the sewage company, water and sewage company. And with respect to the change in government, one thing that we have seen is that this particular government has tried to correct the image of the prior government with respect to the Amazon and to deforestation. So we have received, for example, recently delegations of the Brazilian government that were coming to New York to speak to investors about foreign investment into Brazil in the agro sector. And they were really going out of their way to show that none of what was happening in terms of deforestation touched on the Amazon. There clearly is a kind of a big effort from the government to change the image that the prior government had in some parts of the world with respect to how they were handling the Amazon. So I think that's kind of an interesting development as well.
Thank you, Marcel. So before we move on, because I want to be mindful of time, and I do want to talk a little bit about some global influences in Brazil's market and maybe get some final thoughts from each of you on success stories, but cautionary tales. I would appreciate, Bruno, any thoughts you have on, meaningful, noteworthy on the legal or regulatory landscape that Amadeu and Marcelo may not have mentioned that I think is important for our friends who've joined us on the podcast to be aware of.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that the legal framework is evolving and it's becoming more straightforward. So over the past few years, we had changes dealing with data protection, with the fintech. We have amendments to the Constitution designed to make business more straightforward and to further develop and attract business. We have a new law dealing with guarantees. The FX legislation and the regulatory framework for FX has been evolving and becoming more simplified. So there's still a lot to be done, but I think we are getting there. One of the major concerns that our clients have on the infra sector is how to address the mismatch between a project that generates revenues in Brazilian reais and a cross-border loan, a dollar or euro or pounds denominated loan. So now the current FX regulatory frameworks they allow for this concern to be addressed in a very constructive fashion. And in such connection, we have been working on power generation projects. There are indexed, which financing was indexed to the dollar and are indexed to dollars, but the flow of revenues are primarily in Brazilian reais. The expectation is that this regulatory construction and legal construction can be also taken to toll roads, to other infra projects within the country with a solid stream of revenues in Brazilian reais. So that is to say that the legal framework and regulatory framework is evolving in a positive way, which is a breath of good air. And listen, a lot of what we do, the three of us and our colleagues, we tropicalize the approach, we tropicalize the advice to make sure that our clients, being them in Brazil or outside of Brazil, they are comfortable with the regulatory framework, with the legal framework. We don't practice Brazilian law, we practice New York, we practice laws of the jurisdictions where we are allowed to practice globally. And what we do is we work with a local firm on the ground, and we make sure that our clients are safe and are comfortable in the investment, in the relevant transaction.
Thank you, Bruno. So again, we're a little bit short on time, so I ask all of you to be brief. And obviously, I encourage all our friends who are listening or watching us to feel free to reach out to any one of you individually and get more granular on some of these topics that we've discussed. This tip of the iceberg type of conversation. But a lot has been said about how the war in Ukraine, for example, Ukraine being a breadbasket to Europe and that part of the world, has impacted in the agricultural space globally. And certainly you see countries like Argentina, Brazil, certainly Mexico and others that out of that sad reality that's going on in Ukraine, that there's been an uptick in the agro space because of the issues with the supply chain and food supply coming out of Ukraine. And that has sadly, but to the benefit, if you will, of certain countries that have significant agricultural business. I think a fair amount has been said on how the war in Ukraine has impacted that space. But any other global influences that you think are impacting for good or bad? It could be negative or positive impact on Brazil. Any global trends that you're seeing, major global events that you're seeing that for good or bad are having an impact on the Brazilian economy and foreign direct investment? And I open that question to any of you, whoever wants to take it first.
Maybe I can start by mentioning that when we mention nearshoring, typically Mexico comes to mind, but Brazil is benefiting from that too. Companies want more resilience in their supply chain, and we're seeing companies that usually had their supply needs concentrated in places in Asia, China, if you will. They are moving, and that includes Chinese companies, moving their factories, moving their facilities to Brazil to be a source in the global supply chain more so than Brazil ever was. So that trend is also visible.
Marcello, Bruno, any thoughts on global influences impacting Brazil?
I agree with what Amadeu said. I mean, other than that, I think what I see the most here is the branch out of the Brazilian companies, the Brazilian corporates, the heavy construction companies, if you want to say, as Amadeu mentioned, going global. I think this is a trend that will continue and will only accentuate. And then nearshoring, of course. The Chinese investment on the ground here has been very significant, but I would say less than what it has been in other places, such as in Africa. We've seen a number of investments competing for the same assets with the Chinese, such as the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Europeans. They're all competing with each other.
Super. Marcelo, anything you want to add to what Amadeu and Bruno said as to global influences or trends that you're seeing impacting Brazil?
I think that they address them. I think that basically we are seeing not only in Brazil but in the rest of Latin America an attempt to reposition from the US and to get away from China and to get closer to Mexico, no doubt, but also the rest of Latin America and Brazil by its size, which, as you mentioned, Brazil is benefiting, as bad as it sounds, in some respects from the geopolitical scenario because it is far from the places with tensions at the moment and because it provides agricultural alternatives to Ukraine and to the other spots that are more stressed. And at the same time, the Asians are looking at Latin America and Brazil as an alternative source and market as they are being more restricted into the US. So I think that these influences are clearly playing out.
Francisco, if I may add just one quick thing,
Yeah, please.
just
Please.
very briefly. It is true that to ensure flexibility and resilience in your global supply chain, you want to invest in Latin America, you want to invest in Brazil. It is true that if you want to have food security, Brazil is a major destination of investments. But there's another angle to that conversation, which is if you're a private equity firm and you invest, say, in technology, but you have investments in Asia or elsewhere in Europe, which are places that present their issues. So Brazil has become, comparatively speaking, also an attractive place for those who are looking to diversify their investments, right? Presenting perhaps in some sectors less risk than other regions of the world.
Interesting. So as we wind down today's podcast, I'll just open it up. Anything you want to say in closing? I'll ask some closing remarks from each of you. Again, Brazil presents phenomenal opportunities, obviously some challenges. You have to know how to navigate the landscape, but it's terrific opportunities at the end of the day, both for international companies doing business in Brazil and for Brazilian companies doing business abroad. So would love your open-ended takes on the road ahead for Brazil as we close this podcast. So why don't we start with Bruno?
Yeah, I want to add by saying how important this podcast is and how important this opportunity is. And as you said, I mean, to the extent that any of the listeners have questions to reach out for Marcello, for Amadeu, for myself, we'll be delighted to dig deeper and share more of the know-how that we were able to develop over the past 15, 20 years in doing transactions in Brazil and in Latin America. I think the bottom line is by being on the ground and by doing this for such a long time, we have been able to develop a very specific set of skills in understanding the issues, in understanding where our clients, our investors, and even our counterparties are looking into. And we can anticipate issues. We can, of course, we need to tropicalize the device, make it proper for the relevant jurisdictions that we are looking into, if it's Brazil, if it's Mexico, Peru, Colombia, whatever it is. But we know this and we can be very helpful. And we have a number of very interesting stories, war stories. We've been in the trenches. So sometimes even a transaction that goes south, it teaches us something, how to better structure the collateral package or how to better structure the sets of reps, warrants, and covenants in the M&A transaction. So we can help. We've been there, and I think this is a quite interesting moment for investors to look into the market and do more in Brazil and in the region.
Thank you, Bruno. Amadeu?
Well, I agree with what Bruno just said. As the saying goes, Brazil is not for beginners. That is to say, Brazil has its challenges. But if you have a steady hand and an experienced advisor next to you, and I'd like to believe that that's exactly what we are with this team, you can explore these opportunities and be very successful. It's a country of tremendous potential. So all you need is really the experience to mitigate risks and move forward.
Thank you. Marcello, some closing remarks?
I agree with what Amadeu and Bruno were saying, and I would just add that on a personal note, for me, one of the things that I most enjoy is working in Brazil and out of Brazil. And that is not only because I'm Brazilian as well as European and American, but I particularly enjoy the kind of interplay between these jurisdictions. And Brazilians are warmer and nicer than people in many places. And so I think there is a personal aspect of pleasure in working with Brazil. It might be a childhood thing, but I think that really navigating the interplay between the differences of the expectation of an American investor or of a European investor into Brazil and to explain the subtleties. And I think that these cultural aspects are what I particularly find the most enjoyable, not only into Brazil, but also guiding Brazilian investors into expanding into the US, Europe, or into the world.
Thank you. That brings us to the conclusion of another episode of our DLA Piper Latin America Panorama podcast series. We really appreciate everyone joining us. A privilege, un placer to share this space with Bruno, with Amadeu, with Marcello, who again, cherished and dear colleagues here, partners here at the firm. So I appreciate everyone joining us today. And again, thank you, Bruno, Amadeu, Marcello. Until next time, Francisco Cerezo, be well, and we'll see each other on the next podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take good care.
Thanks, Francisco.
Thank you all.
Thank you for joining us and listening to DLA Piper's U.S. Latin America Panorama podcast. Please be sure to visit and follow us on LinkedIn under DLA Piper in Latin America and via dlapiper.com. If you have topics or speakers you'd like to suggest, please reach out to us at dlapiper.americas@dlapiper.com. Thank you for your interest. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.